GoForThe2.com in with the Week 1 college predictions. Let's jump right into it. Very intriguing battle within Charlotte. It's West Virginia, Big 12 opponent, going up against first-year head coach Jeremy Pruitt and the SEC opponent Tennessee. The game is on a neutral field site. You have a high-octane offense led by Will Grier that threw for 34 touchdown passes, averaged 309 passing yards per game, and pounded the rock for 150 yards against opposing defenses last year, going up against a methodical offense that only averaged 20 points per game in Tennessee, and more importantly, only converted 30% of their third down conversions. Talking about a Tennessee team last year that was 0-8 within the conference of the SEC, and more importantly, had the worst rushing defense, giving up 251 rushing yards per game to opposing offenses within the SEC last year. I think that's the matchup that you want to see play out, going up against a West Virginia offense that pounded the rock for 150 yards per game on the ground. You're talking about a West Virginia offense that does have an elite wide receiver core led by David Sills. He led the nation with receiving touchdowns with 18, and I think he and that wide receiver core can stretch Tennessee's defense vertically, force them into a high-scoring game, and I think West Virginia gets a convincing 44-17 win over Tennessee. Don't think Tennessee, with their new first-year head coach, have the type of personnel with Keller, Christ, or Garantano, whoever gets the start, to match Will Grier score for score in this ballgame. And I still like West Virginia's defense over Tennessee's in this Week 1 matchup. West Virginia gets a convincing Week 1 win over the Volunteers. Another intriguing game is in Orlando. It's defending national champions Alabama going up against Bobby Petrino and Louisville with the new quarterback in Jawan Pass. Very intriguing battle. You know the statistics. Alabama hasn't lost a Week 1 game since 2001. They've won 16 straight against Week 1 opponents by 24.8 points per game. Alabama was 17-1 over the last couple of years against the SEC and have won those 17 games by 26.3 points per game. And Nick Saban against ACC opponents is 7-1 since 2007 and have won those 7 games by 21.1 points per game. But I said it all season long, heading into this Week 1 battle, it was a different Alabama offense at the start of 2017 than it was when they won the national championship. They averaged 298 rushing yards per game in their first 8 games of the year. They were 8-0 in those games and won those 8 games by 33.3 points per game. Over the last 6 games of the year, minus Mercer, Alabama only averaged 170 rushing yards per game, and they have won those 4 games against FBS opponents by 10.5 points per game. You have new defensive co-coordinators for Alabama, new offensive coordinator and Mike Loxley on the offensive side of the ball, and possibly a new quarterback to start the year with Tua Tagovailoa under center. This could be a lot of moving parts for Nick Saban. It's been a long time since he's had both a new offensive and new defensive coordinators to start a Week 1 matchup. And more importantly, you look at the teams that have been able to move the football in recent years on Alabama's defense. You go back to 2014, look at West Virginia and Clint Trickett with Kevin White. They lost that matchup by 10 points. They were able to challenge that Alabama defense and secondary vertically. You look at Chad Kelly and Ole Miss, same type of game plan. Deshaun Watson and Clemson. Colorado State and Mike Bobo and Nick Stevens put up 23 points in Tuscaloosa on Alabama because they neutralized the speed of Alabama's secondary with seam routes and dig patterns and post patterns. That could be the matchup to watch in this Week 1 battle, going up against a very solid wide receiver core in Louisville that has 3 players, Jalen Smith, Des Fitzpatrick, and Seth Dawkins, that combined for 147 receptions, over 2,300 receiving yards, and 20 receiving touchdowns that can challenge that Alabama secondary vertically, minus Tony Brown, minus Minkah Fitzpatrick. And when you're a defensive back, the most important thing or the most hardest thing to do in a Week 1 battle is to understand coverage and read formations. That's what Louisville can pose possibly in this ball game. I'm calling for the upset. I think it'll be high scoring. In the end, Louisville strikes the upset 35-31 over Nick Saban and the crew, stuns the world by knocking off Alabama in this week 1 game. Another intriguing battle, Florida State, Virginia Tech. Game is taking place on Monday night. You're talking about Florida State. DeAndre Francois gets the nod at starting quarterback. Willie Taggart, the new head coach, with renewed optimism for Florida State. This was a team last year that was 7-6 overall, but lost 5 of 6 games within the ACC. They lost those 5 games by 12.4 points per game. In order for Florida State to win, they're going to need to run the football with Patrick and Cam Akers. This was an offense last year that rushed for over 200 yards in 6 of their 13 games. They were 5-1 in those games and won those 5 games by 17.7 points per game. But they're going up against the front 7 in Virginia Tech. Even though there's a lot of suspensions, linebacker Mook Reynolds has been kicked off the team, but this is still a Bud Foster defense that held opposing offenses to only 140 rushing yards per game. They also held 5 of 13 opponents under 100 yards rushing last year. They were 5-0 in those games and won those 5 games by 30.5 points per game. I think that's the matchup that you want to see play out, coupled with the athleticism of sophomore quarterback Josh Jackson. He threw for 20 touchdowns, 7 interceptions last year. I think he could put some pressure on Florida State's defense. When you look at Florida State last year, they struggled with a mobile quarterback and Lamar Jackson. In Tallahassee, they lost that ball game, but they also struggled with teams like Boston College, Clemson, and Louisville. Those 3 teams they were 0-3 against and allowed over 200 yards rushing with guys like Derwin James and Sweat at the defensive tackle and end position for Florida State. They lost those 3 games by 17 points per game. So that's the matchup that you want to see play out. Also keep in mind, if you're going to get Virginia Tech's best effort, it comes week 1 in a conference game. 4 months of preparation, a lot of pressure on Willie Taggart, a lot of pressure on DeAndre Francois. I think Virginia Tech comes into this ball game loose, looking to force turnovers, and they strike the upset over Florida State. They get a 28-24 win in Tallahassee on Monday night. Another intriguing battle is Iowa at home against Northern Illinois. Since 2007, Iowa's 2-1 against the Huskies, and more importantly, have struggled. They won 1 game in 2012. They won that ball game 16-3. They also won a game in 2016 by 1 point, 18-17. So they've struggled with the Huskies in recent years, but you're talking about an Iowa team that lost 5 games in 2017 by 9.8 points per game. This was a team that did defeat Ohio State last year at home in Iowa City, 55-24. They also recorded 21 interceptions as a defensive unit. I know Josh Jackson moves on. I know Josie June moves on, but a physicality on the offensive and defensive lines is the difference to me, coupled with the fact of Nate Stanley that threw for 26 touchdown passes, the most of an Iowa quarterback since prior to 2008. And more importantly, I think the difference maker is Torrin Young. And you look at Iowa's 5 losses last year, they failed to rush for over 100 yards. I think they're a much better and balanced offense this year, and their ability to run the football will make this offense elite. And look for Nate Stanley to possibly challenge his 2017 numbers in this ballgame. I think Iowa's the clear-cut winner in this ballgame. I think they win this ballgame by 20 points or more. Iowa with a convincing 48-20 win over Northern Illinois in this ballgame. Let's keep it in the Big Ten. It's a very intriguing Big Ten independent battle between top 25 opponents, Michigan and Notre Dame on the road in South Bend to face Brandon Wimbush and Brian Kelly. This is a very intriguing battle when you break it down. You look at this ball game, this is a make it or break it game for Jim Harbaugh. He gets former Ole Miss quarterback Shea Patterson that comes over. This was a team last year in Michigan that struggled completing passes and struggled stretching defenses vertically in their 5 losses. In their 5 losses, the Wolverines only completed 48% of their passes, 938 passing yards, 1 touchdown, 6 interceptions. But more importantly, they were a one-dimensional offense that couldn't run the football in those ball games. Opposing defenses stacked the box to force Michigan to beat them over the top. Michigan only averaged 87 rushing yards per game in their 5 losses in 2017. They're going to be going up against the defense that loses in Notre Dame, that loses their defensive coordinator and Mike Elko to Texas A&M. That could be a huge loss. But more importantly, I look at the Notre Dame offense. Led by Brandon Wimbush, he only completed 48% of his passes. This was a Notre Dame offense last year that averaged 269 rushing yards per game. They lose their offensive guard in Quentin Nelson. They lose their offensive tackle in Mike McGlinchey, both to the NFL. They lose their starting running back, Josh Adams, and more importantly, their leading wide receiver, St. Brown, to the NFL. That's a lot of moving parts. It comes down to the Michigan defense as well, led by Rashawn Gary and Chase Winovich. They held opposing offenses to 128 rushing yards per game, 26% on third down conversions. They did record 42 total sacks and only allow 150 passing yards per game. I think Michigan's all in this year. I picked them to win the Big Ten and, more importantly, break the college football playoff as one of the top 4 teams. I'm not backing down now, not sold on Notre Dame, and I do feel that Michigan gets a solid road win over the Fighting Irish in this ball game. I think it's high scoring, though, 31 to 17, 14 points, 31 to 17 over Notre Dame. Michigan and the Wolverines go to 1-0 on the year. 2 other top 25 battles, it's Auburn and Washington. Look at Auburn since 2014. They're 11-13 on the road or on a neutral field site. That's a 468 winning percentage. And you look at their 4 losses last year, LSU, Clemson, UCF, and Georgia, all on the road or on a neutral field site. That's a very intriguing statistic for the Auburn Tigers. And more importantly, this is their 3rd straight game in the Mercedes-Benz Dome. They lost to Georgia in the rematch for the SEC Championship, lost that game 28-7. They lost to UCF as well in the bowl game. Is 3rd time a charm? I don't think so. I think this is a different offense this year, minus Cam Petway and, more importantly, Kerryon Johnson. And you look at the offensive line for Auburn last year, they allowed 36 total sacks. I'm not sold on Ryan Davis or Jarrett Stidham, and I think that the better head coach and, more importantly, the better quarterback in Jake Browning is Washington in this ballgame. Secondary for Washington will be a concern, but unless Auburn can run the football sideline to sideline, I like the speed of Washington in this ballgame. I think Washington wins in convincing fashion. I think they win this ballgame by 17 points or more, calling for a 38-21 win. Washington over Auburn in this battle. Let's keep it in the ACC, SEC. It's Sunday night. It's Mark Richt in Arlington to face LSU and Ed Orgeron. This is a team in Miami last year that was 10-3, lost 3 games to end the year to Pittsburgh, Wisconsin, and Clemson. They were dominated on the offensive and defensive lines by all 3 of those teams. You look at Miami overall, Malik Rozier comes back, but this is an offense in Miami that only converted 29% of their third down conversions. And more importantly, when you look at the Hurricanes on the road or on a neutral field site against teams like North Carolina, Duke, Florida State, and Pittsburgh, they were 3-1 in those games and won those games by 11.2 points per game. Those 4 opponents had a combined overall record of 17-21. They didn't beat up better competition. They feasted off of less competition, and especially at the end of the year. And that's why I like LSU in this ballgame. When you look at LSU as a whole, the one thing that LSU does recruit is significant top 5 offense and defensive line talent and speed from a defensive aspect that can run sideline to sideline. You're talking about an LSU team last year that did rush for over 200 yards in 6 games. They were 6-0 in those matchups and won those 6 games by 17.6 points per game. They also held 5 opponents under 100 yards rushing last year. They were 5-0 in those ball games and won those 5 games by 19.5 points per game. They were able to record stacks towards the end of the year, and more importantly, they forced turnovers as a defensive unit. Joe Burrow comes over from Ohio State. They don't have big names in terms of they lose Darius Geis and Darrell Williams that combined for 76% of the rushing yards and 80% of the rushing touchdowns in 2017. But look out for Edwards-Helaire and Brissett in this ball game. That could be the difference. They'll get healthy going up against a speedy, undersized defensive line in Miami. I think LSU strikes the upset. I think it's in the area of 28-21 LSU gets a 3-point win over the Hurricanes on Sunday night. Stay with me all season long. Show starts this Saturday on Cablevision College Football Today from 10 to 1 p.m. See you then.